Last month, I shared with you Tyler Sorensen's research and perspective on the story of Jesus and the deaf man from Mark chapter 7. If you're not familiar with the story, I encourage you to check out Deaf Mission's ASLV translation or Deaf Harbor's Chronological Bible Translation, CBT. They both explain the story very well. Tyler's paper is available to view using the link at the very bottom of the page. Just click it and his paper will pull up for you to read. This month, we will continue on the topic of Jesus and the deaf man, but it's from a little bit of a different point of view. It's from my perspective on how Jesus responded not only to him, but to so many others as well. Jesus' ministry should inform how we do ministry, especially among those who are marginalized communities. In 2009, I was involved in a discipleship program at California Baptist University, or CBU. The theme of the program was courageous. It was inspired by Joshua chapter 1, verse 9. Our team was assigned to go to Rancho Sordomundo. It's a deaf school in Ensenada, Mexico. Before we went, we watched the movie that's the story of the deaf school and the family that moved and founded it. It's a documentary named Hearing Everett. It's available in the link below, and we're going to provide a link at the very bottom of the page where you can find more information about the film. The film discussed the deaf life in Mexico and in South America as being very hard, starting with parents believing that their deaf children are unable to learn. One story in the film was about Fernando. He's a deaf boy who has Down syndrome, who looked to be about the ages between 4 and 8, somewhere in there. One day, he just stopped going to school, and he disappeared. Many years later, Luke Everett met Fernando's aunt and got the chance to ask why and what happened. Fernando's aunt explained that his mother had paid someone to put the boy on a bus and send him to Guadalajara and just abandon him in the city. This isn't an isolated incident. It happens to many deaf children there. That scene still replays in my mind. There must be justice for these children who God created as his image bearers, who experience and explore his world differently. That story was very personal to me because at that time I was working with children who were not only deaf, but they had other disabilities as well. These kids had a range of different disabilities. For example, autism, Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities, ID for short. I also worked with some kids who had cerebral palsy. It was just an array of different disabilities. And because I was working with them at the time, this story really had impacted me. These kids have a very special place in my heart, and I was privileged to get to know them personally. They have beautiful souls. I just love them. In 2010, my friend asked me, if you had $1 million, what would you do with it? I responded without a second thought. I want to establish several ranches like Rancho Sordomundo for deaf children who were abandoned and ignored. I want to establish a home for them. My friend looked at me and said, that's a big dream, but be real, come on. What would you actually do if you had $1 million? My friend, Dr. Jeff McNair, He has a quote, and he said, "People with disabilities are really people of relationships. They have relationships. They're not just objects to be enrolled in programs or test subjects that we should focus on to measure and change. That's not who they are." This goes for deaf children too. They need to be loved and taught, loved for who they are. Not just a few hours during the school time that you can teach them and be done, but at home where all of their thoughts are open and welcome and be communicated clearly with their parents. That's the key for them. For them to be able to express themselves clearly. To this day, my passion has not faded. In fact, my biggest dream, my wildest, craziest dream is to build a program where we can send different teams to work with local communities. Or perhaps go overseas to do short-term work with deaf children and have the ability to invest in them for the week. That has been my dream for many years. It still is. I'm desperate for deaf children to know, while they're young, that God designed them as His image bearers, with and without special abilities that He gives them, so that they can serve Him and bring glory to Him in a specific way. It's not right that so many children grow up believing themselves to be unwanted. They believe that they're unteachable. They believe that they're automatically disqualified from a relationship with their Creator. That's so untrue. Jesus knew that's not who they were, and He left no room for doubting it. Jesus' hottest anger was displayed at those times when people dared to set up barriers between God and the people. He came to redeem and love His people. Mark chapter 10, 13 through 16 tells of Jesus welcoming and blessing the children. And He had a firm word with His disciples when they tried to block the children from Jesus. Now I want to focus on Mark chapter 7. It opens with Jesus rebuking the Pharisees for putting their rules and traditions above God's law. In doing so, they were setting up barriers, oppressing the people, declaring themselves to be better, and the other people are disqualified from worship. Jesus rebuked that notion. In the next scene, Jesus healed the daughter of a Greek woman based on the woman's faith in Him. The Pharisees would not have approved. They wouldn't have liked it. But Jesus went ahead and did it anyway. Right after that, we reach the story of the deaf man in Mark chapter 7, verses 31 through 36. As we look at Jesus' 3 years of ministry alongside the people, we often see Him advocating for the marginalized. For 3 years, He showed His disciples to do likewise, and He told them to follow His example. This shows the core of God's character, and it has always been this way. Jesus said, "If you have seen me, you have seen my Father." They are one and in full agreement. From the day of creation of mankind all the way to now, they have given us each individuality, a purpose, and even laws protecting our dignity. God cares about us. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 14 says, "Do not curse a deaf person or strip away their values from them." They have characteristics that you can't take away, or don't put something in front of a blind person to stumble over. But fear your God. I am the Lord. I want to emphasize that not only did he say, don't do that, but he emphasized and added at the center of his heart that if you do that, you will face me. And that's a powerful statement. Yet pride, greed, corruption, self-centeredness, misinformation, and so many more have continued to raise barriers between deaf children and the God who loves them. Those barriers that have been there started coming down in the 1700s, but then they were raised again in 1880. Even today, we are quick to emphasize the word hearing in Romans chapter 10, verse 17, and we are fast to focus on the physical ability to hear. We disqualify other methods of God's word, like the ASLV Bible translation, saying those who can't physically hear won't be able to understand the gospel. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think there's a huge majority of deaf people around the world who have not known Jesus? Or that 80% of deaf children in this world do not have access to education in sign language? Why is it that way? Now, about the crowd of people that took the deaf man to Jesus and begged him to touch him. Did they just want to see a miracle? Did they want to change the man so that he would become normal like they were? Or did they want to remove barriers to his worship? I see those as all possibilities of their intentions. But the moment that Jesus looked into the deaf man's eyes, Jesus stood in silence. He didn't use his voice. He didn't pay attention and respond to the crowd that was going on. He didn't use his voice because he knew that that man was deaf by design, that was God's purpose. If you remember in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, when Jesus was talking about why another man was blind, he said that the blindness was not related to his sin, but it was to show the power and the glory of God. It's the same for the deaf man. Jesus took the deaf man aside privately. He honored who the deaf man was and understood that he was a man who had a different way of perceiving the world. And you can reference that to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 20 through 23. Jesus was telling this man that he was created in God's image. He was created for more, to dream, to create, to serve, to love, to share, to fulfill his role in the Great Commission. He was not created to be less than or a servant. He was created to share the love of Jesus. That was what he was made for. The most life-changing moment was when this deaf man understood who Jesus was and who was in him. His value was not based on his ability to hear and speak. Jesus' touch did not eliminate his need for access to sign language. The point is that this deaf man was chosen by Jesus himself, not by the crowd that had taken him to Jesus and asked him to touch him. This man's good works were already planned long before, and his job was to share Jesus with his people and tell them about him. His people were those who had the same language and the same experience as him. My goal is to encourage the communities, including you, to identify and remove different barriers that have deprived deaf children of getting their spiritual needs met. Those include free-flowing communication, the ability to be heard and understood, a sense of belonging, and a foundation of God's Word. To keep deaf children from learning sign language is, as I see it, to hinder their access to Jesus, and that provokes his righteous anger. Deaf children are God's image bearers, the very beings that Jesus died to redeem. If we don't address their spiritual needs, how will they know their Creator? How can they know? Yes, I do believe that through the power of our advocacy and our prayers, we will tear down the barriers built by greed and self-centeredness. We will all experience the beauty of human flourishing. Jesus fought openly against oppression, and I believe that we should too. This starts with you asking God and praying, "My Lord, my God, should I learn sign language today to begin meeting the spiritual needs of deaf children?" Peace be with you all.